sovereign God is all of these visions and all of these dreams and every intervention of God into the history of Babylon and the Jews and the Medo-Persian Empire. Every one of them is dealing with the affairs of nations and the turnover of empires. And it's amazing the history that is found within all of these prophecies. And just as a general note, why is it important that the history be correct in a book that is giving predictive prophecy? What's that?
Kind of a no-brainer, really.
Well, why?
Well, you want to know that what's happened in the past is true, so that you'll know what's coming forward is true.
Absolutely. What would it say about Daniel if he is a prophet of God in the affairs of nations, if he messed up the history that he was living in the middle of, purportedly? What's that? He wouldn't be a prophet. That's right. There would be an inaccuracy there. It also would lend itself to the false claim of some that these writers of predictive prophecy, the Isaiahs and the Jeremiahs and the Ezekiels and the Daniels, were actually written after the fulfillments and were written as if they were predictions. So they were retrospective lies masquerading as predictive prophecy. And so it is important that in the whole context of this prophecy, that even the history. Now, I use that as a giant excuse because I love history. So y'all have to be subjected to the history behind this. You know, I find it fascinating, but what I find even more fascinating is how correct it is. All right, so we're going to remind ourselves that Daniel is not a chronology. There is a stream, a flow to it, because it passes between two empires. It's Babylon at first and Medo-Persia next. But we find there are 4 chapters that are out of chronological order. Each of these, incidentally, is written in Aramaic, and so that may account for the reason that it was just compiled this way. It doesn't really matter, other than the fact that it gets quite confusing, because you will have Belshazzar as the king, and you'll have in the first year in chapter 7, in his third year in chapter 8, and then today, as we're going to see, when he dies. So he can't die before his first year or before his third year, logically speaking. So we've been studying these in chronological order. Today we're going to look at chapter 5, understanding that. We looked last week and tried to get a gauge of Daniel's age at the time in history that this was written. This is a little squishy. It's not a precise science. But if we look all the way down to the final year of Belshazzar's reign, which would be his 12th year, that adding up everybody else's reigns in the historical context, that Daniel is somewhere around 78 years old when this happens. He may be as old as in his early 80s. Which you got to keep in mind then that the next chapter is chapter 6. Quick quiz, see who's paying attention in Faith Lane or in VBS. What happens in chapter 6 to Daniel? Lion's Den, absolutely. All right, we have some gold stars to pass out. We'll get those after class. He was an old man when he got thrown into the lion's den. And I would, go so far as to say, no offense to anyone, because I'm rapidly approaching there, he was a decrepit old man by this time. And he was tossed into the lion's den and would have been easy prey for those hungry lions. But, of course, that isn't what happened there. So just keep in mind that the opening scenes in chapter 1, Daniel's a young man, late teens, probably it's figured around 17 years old. When he got there, but by this time, he's an old guy. And so a lot of history has passed before we get there. All right. So we find in Daniel chapter 5, we are in the midst of the reign, 7 and 8, and now in chapter 5, of Belshazzar. Who was this king? Well, as we saw a if you were paying attention. He was actually a co-regent with his father, Nabonidus. And a co-regent is basically two people serving as the monarch at the same time. And it was done very often with fathers and sons, so that when the father passed, the son would already be in power, and there would be no issues with who was going to succeed to the throne. And so now we have this kind of a situation that is going on there. And so this is who Belshazzar was. But I want to draw your attention to Jeremiah 27. And if we look at, let's go with verses 6 and 7, the prophet Jeremiah is talking about the nations that will submit to Nebuchadnezzar, the nations that will be overwhelmed with Nebuchadnezzar. And remember, this, he is a prophet of God, just as we find with Daniel. But there, it is very interesting, some of the history that he gives in this portion, and how it dovetails beautifully with Daniel. But it helps us kind of understand what's going on here. Now, verse 6. Now I have given all the lands into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, my servant. I have given him also the wild animals of the field to serve him. All nations shall serve him, and his son and his grandson, until the time of his own land comes. Then many nations and great kings will make him their servant. All right, so this is a prophecy of the career of Nebuchadnezzar, and also the fact that his reign is going to come to an end. His empire is going to end. What was he referred to by God in that first vision that he had of the giant statue? What did he occupy? The head of gold. And there are times that Nebuchadnezzar is going to talk about how God has given him all of this, and God has dealt bountifully with him, and how he does reign over all of this. And it seemed at that point in time that this is an empire that just would not end. He's just way too powerful, way too wealthy. Of course this is going to last forever. Well, Jeremiah, before Nebuchadnezzar had ever taken the throne and then taken Jerusalem and dragged Judah into captivity, Jeremiah had already foretold the fact that his kingdom was going to come to an end when it was in the hands of his grandson. All right, so that's where we want to kind of think about this with Belshazzar. All right, so his first son, the one who became king after Nebuchadnezzar, was Evil Merodach. Now, I know that's in another language, but whoever would name their son Evil is just asking for trouble. But this guy was actually a fairly good king. He ruled a lot like his father did. We're going to see he showed some grace to the exiled and imprisoned king of the Hebrews there, and it may have cost him his life and cost him his throne. But he was the eldest son of Nebuchadnezzar. All right, so just as Jeremiah foretold, he reigned. Well, the second son, Neriglissar, didn't like what Evil Merodach was doing, and so he deposed him and took his throne from him. And Neriglissar's son, grandson of Nebuchadnezzar, also reigned, but only for a short time. These two ruled for a combined period of just a couple of years. At most, it was about 5 years, probably more closer to 4. But they reigned for just a little while. And then the son-in-law, Nabonidus, took over the throne again. His daughter was Nebuchadnezzar's son. His wife was Nebuchadnezzar's daughter. And now he is in that line when both of these other brothers are gone. And Belshazzar is his son. So it is the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar, but not in a direct line as we might have seen with Jeremiah. He says his son, and then his grandson or his son after him. So let's think about that a little bit and kind of stew on it and see if we have a problem with Daniel's history. Or is this something that is just simply the way that people talk and people made reference to things back then? All right, so let's go all the way back to 2 Kings chapter 25, and we'll pick up there in 27. Now it came about in the 37th year of the exile of Jehoiachin, king of Judah, in the 12th month, on the 27th day of the month, that Evil-Merodach, king of Babylon, in the year that he became king, released Jehoiachin, king of Judah, from prison. All right, why might this be an issue for some in Babylon? What does a king in prison in a conquering empire represent? What's that? The threat? Absolutely. But if he's still in prison, what does he represent? Power. If you are a king who holds kings in chains, you're a bad dude. You have power over the people that you have forced into submission, that you rule, that you reign. It's also going to cause the Jews to kind of stay in line a little bit, to keep their king alive. But now he's releasing him. All right, so what kind of an impact is that going to have on the Jews potentially? Happy, sad? Happy. That'd be great. They're exercising some freedom now. They're going to enjoy a little bit greater elbow room in this kingdom, because now we've got a king who is sympathetic to us. What might this do with some of the Babylonian people?
Not happy about it.
They wouldn't be happy about it. All right, so there is the potential, at least, that this occurrence is the reason that Evil-Merodach's brother, Neriglissar, murdered him and took his throne, was because he was not being faithful to their father. He was losing sight of the vision. He was going out on his own. He was showing grace where they should not have shown grace. Well, maybe he was simply doing what his father had asked him. Notice that it said that in the first year of his reign, he let him go. What happened to Nebuchadnezzar after he lost his mind and was grazing with the oxen and came back into his own mind? What was his attitude toward God?
Completely changed.
Completely changed. He was in submission. That's my God. That's the real God. That's the God that gave me everything. That's the God that has been gracious to me. And now he's given me back my kingdom. Nebuchadnezzar was effusive in his praise for the one true God, the God of the Hebrews. Maybe, capitalized perhaps, because we don't know, maybe he instructed his son, look, when I die, let their king out of prison. Let's be good to their king, and their God will continue to be good to us. Maybe. Who knows? Maybe this young king, the son of a great king, was trying to, carve out his own way. Who knows? Maybe he was just simply being a nice guy, showing compassion on all of this. Richard?
Do we know what was required of people back in the Old Testament when they became a proselyte Jew? As far as, did they make them go through some kind of a purification process or something before they were recognized as a Jewish convert?
Yeah, they were essentially baptized, believe it or not. They didn't call it baptism because that's obviously a Greek word, but they were washed, ritually cleansed, and then grafted into the kingdom.
Yeah, it would seem to me it wouldn't be too far-fetched to think that Daniel may have influenced this Murdoch, whatever it was, to help him get the king of Judah out of the slammer, as it were. Right?
Sure.
Daniel was in a position of power. He was the first guy that the king came to at court.
Absolutely.
I think that Daniel could have possibly had some influence on that.
Absolutely. There's a lot going on here that we do not have recorded in this history. Because again, decades have passed from the time that Daniel was first there. He rose to prominence. He's been in a very powerful position all along. And so we have this question here, but the Babylonians, they don't like it. And so it possibly accounts for why he was slain. All right, the last thing I want us to do is go back to Jeremiah 24, and I want us to kind of set the table for what happens in Daniel chapter 5. Because at the beginning of Daniel chapter 5, Belshazzar is going to throw a great big party. And this is where we get the handwriting on the wall that comes up at this party. But in the midst of this party, it says that they're going to take all of the treasures that they had taken out of the temple in Jerusalem. And they're drinking out of the glasses or the goblets, and they are eating off of the plates that were consecrated to the temple. And they're consecrated for the use of the priests, and only for the priests. They were considered holy utensils. And so there's going to be a problem that's going to arise because of that. But let's go back and catch what happened before all of this, and pick up in Jeremiah, 2 King. I'm sorry, I said Jeremiah, didn't I? All of you that were following along in your Bibles, let's go to 2 Kings 24. Not Jeremiah, I'll give you more time. I apologize. And we'll pick up in verse 11 there. And Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, came to the city, that would be Jerusalem, and while his servants were besieging it, Jehoiachin, king of Judah, went out to the king of Babylon, he and his mother and his servants and his captains and his officials. So the king of Babylon took him captive in the 8th year of his reign. He carried out from there all the treasures of the house of the Lord and the treasures of the king's house, and cut in pieces all the vessels of gold which Solomon king had made in the temple of the Lord, just as the Lord had said. Then he led away into exile all Jerusalem and all the captains and the mighty men of valor, 10,000 captives, and all the craftsmen and smiths. None remained except the poorest people of the land. And so we have this time of transition here, and we find the captivity of a king that was let loose and possibly was his benefactor, Evil-Merodach, was probably slain because he was now let loose, let out of jail after quite a while, decades in a Babylonian prison. And so we make us all the way to Daniel chapter 5, where we find this feast that is going on. It's in the final year, in fact, the final couple of days of his reign, 539 BC. There is, at this moment in time, camped outside of Babylon, Cyrus, king of Persia's vast army waiting. There's historical evidence that the Persians knew about this feast that was going on, and they were just waiting for the feast to play out. What happened at feast amongst the pagans? What's that? Everybody got drunk. Would it be easier or more difficult to take a capital city if everybody in the city's drunk? Okay, question asked, question answered. So this was actually a very wise thing to do. But remember, God has raised up Cyrus. God is in control of nations. And God has prophesied all of this to come and to take place. So everything is working as God has orchestrated this. All right, somebody, if you don't mind reading for us the first 4 verses of Daniel chapter 5. All right?
King Belshazzar made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in front of the 1,000. Belshazzar, when he tasted the wine, commanded that the vessels of gold and of silver that Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken out of the temple in Jerusalem be brought, that the king and his lords, his wives and his concubines, might drink from them. Then they brought in the golden vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his lords, his wives and his concubines drank from them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone.
All right, is there anything here, reading between the lines, anything here that might anger Yahweh.
Yeah.
Okay, is there anything here that might not anger Yahweh? This is everything that is wrong is going wrong here. What does verse 4 mean? What are they doing?
They are blaspheming against God by worshiping other idols.
That's right. They are engaging in idolatry while using the consecrated holy vessels in a mockery of God, of his grandfather's God, Nebuchadnezzar's God. Jim.
They were praising the creation rather than the creator.
Bingo. That's exactly right. And this was at the essence of what will make God angry. And this is what he had warned people about all the time. So he obviously is not of the same mindset as his grandfather. He had not been brought up in the training and admonition of the Lord. He had not been taught to love the Lord thy God. The Lord is one with all of his heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love his neighbor as himself. He is engaged in a revelry. He is engaged in a huge feast for thousands of people. He is showing his power, his sovereignty, his dominion over his kingdom. And that is flying in the face of God. All right, so this is something that is, of course, highly offensive to God in every aspect of what's going on. All right, so remember, God has already foretold through Jeremiah that Nebuchadnezzar, the next generation, and the next generation would reign, but after that, they were going to get cut off. He had already prophesied in Daniel that you are the head of gold. There's another kingdom that is coming. That is going to be the breast of silver that is going to come along behind you. It's not going to be as wealthy as you, but it is going to be more expansive. It's going to be bigger. We also saw that a couple weeks ago, or last week, the ram and the goat. The ram that would rise up would be Medo-Persia. They were identified by name in Daniel's prophecy. Now, you would think if you were, kind of a politically savvy king, and you've got a prophet that has served your grandfather and your father, and he can do amazing things. He can interpret dreams. God is with him. It caused the conversion of your own grandfather to his faith, and you might want to listen to this guy. But, kings are interesting characters. They tend to want to make their own way, do their own thing, and it appears as though Belshazzar was doing exactly that. So God intervenes supernaturally. He's done this with dreams given to Nebuchadnezzar. He's done this with dreams and visions given to Daniel. Now he's going to intervene and make an appearance all by himself. And it is going to be something for all to see, and it is going to cause the king, let's say, great consternation here. So we find the king reduced from his arrogance in the first 4 verses. He's going to be reduced to something less than arrogant there. Somebody read verses 5 and 6 for us.
Suddenly the finger of man's hand emerged and began writing opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the back of the hand and that did the writing. Then the king's face grew pale, and his thoughts alarmed him, and his hip joints went slack, and his knees began knocking together.
All right. That's an amazing description of what it did to this guy. What kind of an effect did this vision have on the king of Babylon?
Got his attention.
It got his attention, Kevin? It made him very nervous. His knees are knocking. His hips are failing him. It is something that is plaguing his body and his mind. He's worried about this. That would be an amazing thing to see. And it's just the importance of it is lost, or not lost on him. The meaning of it is lost on him. He doesn't understand it, but he knows that's not good. So at least he's that perceptive to pick up on the fact that this is not good. But he's just literally quaking in his boots because of what he is seeing. Now, if you want some fun, just go ahead and do some research on this. There are interesting arguments among commentators as to whether the finger of this hand wrote on the wall or whether it was actually a stylus. Does that matter? That matter to anybody? Anybody upset if we don't know? No, it does not matter. What we know that there's this giant hand where God himself is writing on the wall. All right, and so this is that's all we need to know. If there were any other details we needed, then we would certainly have them. All right, so how does this idolatrous, profane king react when something like this happens? How did Nebuchadnezzar react? When he had a dream, who did he call?
His charmers.
All of his charmers and magicians and the Chaldeans, as they were called, the conjurers, all of the mystical people in his kingdom, he gathered them all together. Why? Because that's what Babylonians did. That's who they were. That was part of their religion here. So he's going to gather together all of these people, and he is going to try to figure out what this means. Meanwhile, his knees are shaking, his joints are slack, and his mind is troubled. So he has a very motivated mindset here. And it says he called aloud to bring in the conjurers, the Chaldeans, the diviners, and the king spoke to the wise men of Babylon, any man who can read this inscription and explain its interpretation to me shall be clothed with purple and have a necklace of gold around his neck and have authority as the third ruler of the kingdom. Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the inscription or make known the interpretation to the king. Then King Belshazzar was greatly alarmed. His face grew even paler, and his nobles were perplexed. All right, so the kingdom is in disarray at this point. There is great consternation here. All right, so he says, I will make this guy the number 3 guy in Babylon. Now remember, there's a co-regency here. King Belshazzar is truly king, but he is co-regent with his own father. So his father is ruler number 1. He is ruler number 2. So whoever can do this gets to be the 3rd guy. That's still pretty good in the Babylonian Empire, other than the fact that the clock is ticking and they're not going to be around for much longer. But still, it's kind of a cool thing because these guys have forgotten God. They have forgotten the prophecies. They didn't pay any heed to it, and so they were going to suffer for it. But again, this is a great inducement here. This is a highly motivated king. All right, so all of this is going on. And then it says the queen, excuse me, entered the banquet hall. Now, when you read that at first, who is she married to, do you think? Maybe Belshazzar. Except it said all his wives were already at the party. Well, he's co-regent, so maybe it's his dad's wife. Well, what it appears like, and we'll look at some of the detail, this is more than likely Nebuchadnezzar's widow. And there is historical evidence that even though he died, she didn't lose her position until she dies. So this isn't the British Empire. This is a different way of reigning. She couldn't reign, but she kept her title until death. So this is more than likely his grandmother coming in. And you're going to see she relates a lot of things about Daniel and about Daniel's God and things like that kind of bolster that here. So more than likely, that's who this is Nebuchadnezzar's widow. All right, so the queen entered the banquet hall because of the words of the king and the nobles. The queen spoke and said, "O king, live forever." All right, this is not a wife who is speaking of her husband. This is a very formal address here by somebody to this king. "Do not let your thoughts alarm you or your face be pale. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is a spirit of the holy gods." We've seen that terminology before. There is pantheism afoot in Babylon, and there always has been. Only when Nebuchadnezzar came to his senses and quit grazing in the field did he become a monotheist here. But again, this is a pantheistic empire here. So this is a wise man. This guy follows a god, and the spirit of the gods is in him. "And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king." Wait a minute, I thought this was his grandson. There's a lot of people that will assault Daniel, the writing here, critically because of that. But this is simply the way things were spoken back in that day and that time. It's the same manner of referring to your forefathers as the Jews saying, "Abraham is your father." Jesus, if you ask him, he would say, "David is his father. Solomon is his father." Why? Because he was a forefather. And so that is simply the way things were spoken here, even though this is clearly and demonstrably and verifiably not true. This was not his bio-dad. He is a grandson here. But anyway, King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, appointed him chief of the magicians, conjurers, Chaldeans, and diviners. This was because of an extraordinary spirit, knowledge, and insight, interpretation of dreams, explanation of enigmas, and solving of difficult problems were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Let Daniel now be summoned, and he will declare the interpretation. She remembered vividly the things that Daniel had done. All right, so now he is coming around, and he is going to be called in here. Daniel is likely, and we can't say anything emphatically here, but he is likely in some sort of a modified retirement at this point due to his age. He is not somebody that would come to the knowledge of this young king who is in the 12th year of a reign. You would think that in 12 years this powerful man Daniel would have come to the knowledge of the king, but he didn't. So he's more than likely somehow semi-retired or retired during this time. For whatever reason, he's fallen out of the mind of the king, and the king had no idea who he was till Grandma shows up. He is a servant of whomever is in power because he's a servant of God who put that king in power. So if he serves God and God appointed this king, then he serves that king. So he's not a traitor to his people. He is a faithful follower of God. God put him in these positions here, and he's been there the whole time. He was brought there in the 3rd year of Jehoiakim, not Jehoiachin, the one that was released. The 3rd year of his reign. He was one of the first exiles that was brought over there, again at the age of 17. Decades have passed. He's been there a minute, and he's seen a lot, and he's done a lot. And he comes when he is summoned here. All right, let's go back to pick up in verse 13. Daniel's brought before the king. The king spoke and said to Daniel, "Are you the Daniel?" So we see he doesn't know him. "Are you the Daniel who was one of the exiles from Judah, whom my father the king brought from Judah? Now I have heard about you that a spirit of the gods is in you, and that illumination, insight, and extraordinary wisdom have been found in you." Who's he not attributing this to? He's not attributing this to God. He's giving it to a man who has a spirit of the gods in him. "Just now the wise men conjurers were brought before me, that they might read this inscription and make its interpretation known to me. But they could not declare the interpretation of the message. But I personally have heard about you." He's the king, right? He gets to claim all kinds of things. You know, his grandmother just came in and told him. He had no idea who Daniel was until then, but he's kind of inserting himself into this. Heard about you that you're able to give interpretation, solve difficult problems. Now, if you're able to read the inscription and make its interpretation known to me, you will be clothed with purple, wear a necklace of gold around your neck, and you will have authority as the third ruler in the kingdom. Then Daniel answered and said before the king, keep your gifts for yourself, or give your rewards to someone else. However, I will read the inscription given to the king and make its interpretation known to him. Why would Daniel turn this down?
Because he's too old to really give it.
Exactly. He's an old man.
I mean, what would it do him?
What would it do him? Why else?
It's not God's plan.
It's not God's plan. Why else? If Daniel takes this, what is that saying to a king that doesn't even acknowledge God? I did this. So there's all of this that's in play here. Daniel is very humble, and he is just accepting of all of this and this burden that God places on him. He's not going to take this position. His time has come, but he also knows that the time of the Medes and the Persians is coming.
Yeah, why does he want to have his head on a spit?
Exactly. So, back off. Just let this unfold. I'll tell you what you need to know here. So we find that Daniel is going to do this. He's going to interpret this. But remember, there's some writing on the wall here. We're going to see it in just a minute. Why couldn't the wisest men in Babylon read it?
Maybe it was in the hand of the Israelis.
It's actually in a foreign tongue to the Babylonians. Remember, these 4 chapters are written in Aramaic. And so this inscription is written in Aramaic. Daniel doesn't have to wait for God to give him the inscription because he speaks Aramaic. And so he's going to walk in the room and just read it. He's going to know exactly what it says because he speaks that language. But these wise men do not. So God has put him in this position, but this is a no-brainer. But he's then going to interpret the inscription beyond translating it. Translating it is all Daniel. Interpreting it is all God. And so Daniel is going to do what he needs to do. All right, somebody read for us verses 18 through 23.
O king, the most high God gave Nebuchadnezzar your father kingship and greatness and glory and majesty. And because of the greatness that he gave him, all peoples, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him, whom he would have, from he would he kill, and whom he kept alive, whom would he raise, but whom he raised up, and but whom he would be humbled. But then his heart was lifted up, and the spirit was hardened, so that he dealt proudly. He was brought down from his kingly throne, and his glory was taken from him, as he was driven from among the children of mankind. His mind was made like that of the beast, and his dwelling was with the wild donkeys. He was fed grass like an ox, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, until he knew that the Most High God rules the kingdom of mankind and sets over it whom he will. And you, his son, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, though you knew all of this. But you lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven, and the vessels of the house have been brought in before you, and you and your lords and your wives and your concubines have drinking wine from them. And you have praised the gods of silver, gold, bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which do not see or hear or know, but the God in whose hands your breath and those are all your ways have not been honored.
All right, so you don't honor the God who gave you life and who holds your life in his hand. All right, that's how he sums up all of this. You're worshiping and bowing down before all of these idols, and they cannot even speak, they cannot even hear, and they have no mind to understand anything. Daniel is speaking very bluntly to this king. But I think that the most important thing is found in verse 22. He's recounting everything that Daniel said, or that had happened to Nebuchadnezzar. And he said, you did not humble your heart, even though you knew what God did to your grandfather. All right, so he set the table. This is God who is acting in this. And so now the handwriting on the wall. This is given a cliche to us. Anytime something is obvious, you see the handwriting on the wall. Everything's pointing to this outcome. And yet this is what's happened here. All right, so he sees this inscription. He reads the inscription, and then he interprets the inscription there. Now this is the inscription that was written out. Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. And this is the interpretation of the message. Mene, God has numbered your kingdom and put an end to it. In Aramaic, that's what this word means, is numbered. And put an end to it is divine prophecy. Daniel is telling him what God is giving him as the inscription on it. Now, this has application to us. Every life has a limit. It is appointed for man once to die, and then comes the judgment. Keep that in your mind as we go through the handwriting on the wall, because what applied to the king of Babylon applies to you. And it applies to me. This is not earth-shattering. This is divine. This is exactly what God does. God is sovereign over all souls that he has created here. But every life has numbered days. And so we have the first part of that inscription here. But the abuse of what God has given us, as we saw in the parable of the talents, if we abuse it or just simply let it waste away, then that has consequences. And that's exactly what he's telling this king. That's exactly what Jesus tells us. So this is, again, God is not being a respecter of persons. This is something that is the way that God deals with people. Tekel means weighed. All right, so you have been weighed in the balance. Your days are numbered. You've been weighed in the balance. Upharsin, you've been found wanting. You're light. This isn't adding up. So you have an accusation, you have a trial, and you have a judgment. You have all of this coming out here. But every life comes into judgment. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, Paul tells us we all must appear before the judgment seat of Christ and give an account for the things that are done in the body, whether good or bad. All right, so he's going to be weighed. In fact, he says you already have been weighed. All right, this is up for you. What ways was he found right? Well, Daniel just told him. You knew all that God had done with Nebuchadnezzar, and yet you didn't humble yourself. You're arrogant, and you abused and blasphemed and followed after idols anyway. All right, so that was where he found light. Just think on the things and the ways that we can be found wanting when we are weighed in the balance and come up short. That is there. But that is true of him and is true of us. Now there's an interesting thing here, because if you look down in verse 28, you're going to see a different word than you saw in verse 25. Upharsin, and then in verse 28, Perez. The interpretation of it is your kingdom has been divided and given over to the Medes and the Persians. All right, well that first word means break into pieces. Shattering a pot, for instance. It leaves a pile of shards. It's a different word that he brings in that second time. It means divided. All right, so you have that concept. God is going to complete this thought here. What are the implications of the fact that God broke your kingdom into pieces? It's because he's now going to divide it up. The sentence is announced by God. This is a done deal. All right, this is over. Your time has come, and there is nothing left for you. Now it's interesting how he responds to this, how the king responds to this. He gives him everything that he promised he would give him. It's like, did you not hear what I just said? Did you not hear what was just announced, and you're now making me the third ruler in a kingdom that's about to end? Well, he didn't look at it that way. He didn't see it that way. He didn't see the importance of this. All he could think about was, hey, I made this promise. I'm going to give this guy this stuff. Everything's going to be okay. But he made no attempt to repent. He made no attempt to appeal to God. He did not humble himself before God. He simply gave out what he felt he had sovereign power to give out. And yet God had numbered his days and had numbered his kingdom and was going to give it over to a foreign power. The Persian army attacked that night. It was instantaneous. And so we have God fulfilling what some in the world might call instant karma. This is instant karma. He got what he was owed right there in that moment and in that time. All right, we're running short, but I'm going to come through here. We'll pick this up because we'll have the same discussion at the beginning of chapter 6. All right, so chapter 30. The same night, Belshazzar the Chaldean king was slain. So Darius the Mede received the kingdom at about the age of 62. Now it's interesting, he tells us he's 62. There was a king named Darius. And there's a lot of people that simply go, oh, well, this is Darius. Well, then it's also going to, chapter 6 and verse 1, it seemed good to Darius to a point, and then we're going to see later that we're going to meet Darius again. Is this king Darius? And the answer is no. This is Darius the Mede, who we're given his age, which gives us a clue. This is a guy named Ugbaru, and he's actually a governor of a province, and he's serving as a king. The records of the Persians bear this out. They're camped outside. They knew of this feast. They pounced here, and he comes in as the general, and he receives the kingdom. It doesn't mean he becomes the king. He accepted the surrender, is all that this is telling us. Darius the Mede received the kingdom. It's designating who he is, and it's designating his age. Why is his age important? All right, so let's look at what is going to happen, or what would happen if this was King Darius. All right, we know for an historic fact that Darius was born in 550 and died in 486 BC. All right, so this occurs 559, during the time of Darius the Great in 559 BC. All right, so this guy's a young man. He's not 62. But if he were 62 at the time, he would have died at the age of 114. And that is simply not how old he was. That's simply not when he reigned. King Darius is a different guy than Darius the Mede. The numbers don't add up. History bears it out. And we're going to meet next week not only one more, but two more Dariuses that are going to take place, none of whom are this king, Darius. All right, so hold that thought in abeyance until we come back next week. We'll discuss it some more next week. But don't get confused when you're reading through this and going, wait a minute, Cyrus is supposed to be the first king of the Medes and the Persians when they came in and took this, and yet now we're all of a sudden at Darius. No, he was the fourth ruler in that reign, and there's no way that the numbers add up for him. Again, we'll pick up next week. Any closing thoughts, comments, questions?
Basically, the Father saw all these miracle things happen, so he bowed down to the Lord. The Son saw these things happen, so he was humbled. The grandson probably didn't see it happen, so he didn't believe it.
Right.
So he drifted away.
Absolutely. And apparently they didn't do a good job telling him of all the things that Yahweh had done for them and for their kingdom, that would have been handy dandy information to give to a young ruler that, oh, by the way, there's a prophecy hanging out there that at some point in time the Medes and the Persians are coming.
And it could be he's just a victim of the indulgence of the blessings that were provided.
Absolutely.
In other words, things just have always been this way.
Absolutely. And when he brought the vessels from the temple into an idolatrous feast, mocking God, he kind of showed he was flexing, as kings tend to do. All right. Thank you all for being here. Appreciate your time and attention, and look forward to our time of worship together.